Hello once again. Welcome to Grow Vespers. I want to welcome everyone who's joined us online from various churches from United as well as Central Filipino. And thank you to those who have joined us here in person. For those of you who don't know, we are trying to transition to more in person. As I've said in the past, we can't really be a church without others. So we need to, in order to be a church, you can't do church alone, so you need others. The series that we've been going over, it's kind of a running series. It's one we'll continue to come back to. We'll do other devotionals other than this. But I thought it was very interesting to go over sort of back to basics. So this series is entitled Words of the Word. So far we've gone over grace. We've gone over faith. And today's topic will be about, next slide, about covenant. So grace and faith is something that's typically talked about. Grace and faith is more so ones you hear all the time. Covenant sounds like a very old term, one of those very Bible-y, biblical terms. Covenant is typically something we don't really think about, and I would say especially in today's modern world is something kind of lost in the way that we think about how promises work. Of course, that's the way we think of the word covenant. But again, why we're going over this series, why we're going over the words of the word is because oftentimes we use these terms over and over, but it's essential in order to not lose its meaning, to return back to form and remember, what does the Bible say about these terms? What was meant in the time that these terms were told? Because often we'll read it in our modern day thinking and take the meaning from what we think rather than what the Bible says and what the Bible is trying to say. So once again, we're talking about covenant. And typically when you hear of the word covenant, you probably think promise. You make a promise or you make an agreement, which isn't too far off. If you can go to the next slide. For example, in the Latin convenire, it simply means a coming together. Or more specifically, a coming together of two parties. And sometimes if you look up the word covenant, it'll be following this definition. In other words, it's where two parties, where two groups or two people come together to make an agreement or to form a bond. Sometimes that could be used, for example, in marriage. In a way, it's coming to make an agreement. Sometimes it's just simply contractual, where it's your two parties make a contract. However, that's just the Latin term. Again, that's not the biblical term. Let's go to the next slide. Now, in the Hebrew, the word berit is actually the root word that is used for covenant. It's interesting because the root word berit actually doesn't mean anything much of joining or combining. It actually means almost the opposite, where it's cutting or to cut. And that sounds a little strange. So how is a covenant divisive? How is a covenant about splitting? Again, it could be cutting or to cut, or other words it's also used is to split. Now, why would the Bible or this biblical Hebrew version of the word use to cut or to split? Well, the reason for that is because in the olden times, back in the long old days of the Bible, there was a tradition where in order to make a covenant, this was kind of where the word came from, why it's cutting or to cut, is because, for example, this would happen where two people decided to get married. They would actually line up the carcasses of dead animals, and they would split them in half. And to form the covenant, so let's say you lined up the carcasses of these animals. Half of the animals on one side, split one half of them, more specifically, half of them on the other side. They're split in half, and to form the covenant, you would then walk through the split animals. And basically what that's trying to say is these animals are split, but because I have walked through these animals, it's a symbol of saying, if I break my promise, if I break the bond, if I break the contract, if I break the covenant, in the same way these animals are cut in half, so will I be cut in half. In other words, this promise is almost a blood pact. It's for life. I stake my life on this. That's why it's to cut, because it's saying that these promises, a covenant isn't simply of just take my word for it. A covenant isn't simply just an agreement. That's why we have those terms. But covenant, in the biblical sense, is far deeper. It's I stake and I place my entire life, my soul, my blood on this covenant. It's life binding, it's blood binding. So if I break this covenant, I too will be split. And they would actually do this for marriages. For example, if we go to the next slide, Matthew 19:6, talking about marriage, it says, so they are no longer two, but how many flesh? One. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined, let no one separate. In other words, once you get married, once you guys come together, you are not two individuals anymore. You become one whole. You become one being. And now with our understanding of covenant in the biblical sense, in the original wording of it, this is why divorce, for example, is so looked down upon and is so heinous to God. Because once you create this covenant, man and woman, you come together, you are no longer individuals. So if you were to split apart, it's not saying that we're just disagreeing. You're not saying that we're just parting ways now. You're not saying that now we just move apart. It's no, we now are one whole being, and if we leave, we will be destroyed because we will be split in half. The problem that you see today in society is there's a lot of this thinking that divorce is okay, or divorce is becoming normalized. Divorce is becoming, almost commonplace. You look at divorce rates and it's above 50%, which can scare people into going to marriages. But I think it's often because we don't take that whole oath, that covenant of till death do us part. That's the covenant. I cannot leave this marriage unless I am split, unless I am pulled apart, unless I am cut in half. I cannot leave this covenant. Next slide. In the Hebrew, the word is Brit Brian Habetorim. It's Brit Brian Habetorim. I believe I hope I pronounced that properly. It's kind of a mouthful. But it pretty much means a covenant between the parts. And this is referring to a very famous covenant within the Bible. Within the Bible, there's multiple kinds of covenants. But this really showcases what the meaning of this covenant and how it ties to God and how it ties to the redemption story. The covenant between the parts. In Genesis chapter 15, and this is the main story I want to share with you. It says, I'm going to start with verse 1. It says, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. This is Abraham. This is Abram. So in other words, he hasn't become Abraham yet. He's asking God for a son. He wants God to fulfill his promise to give him a son so that he can fulfill the promise to have the chosen generation. It says, so I'm going to start early on. We'll have more text up there. But I want to read the whole story for those who aren't familiar with the story. So in Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, it says, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He says, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, said, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. This is God's promise to Abram. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars. If you count them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. God is establishing what his promise is going to be. Verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and he accredited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said to the Lord, sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain the possession of it? So now Abram is looking to the Lord. How do I know you're going to stay true to your word? How do I know that you're going to keep your end of the bargain? How do I know you're going to keep this promise to me? So a covenant hasn't been established yet. Because remember, the covenant is between the two parties. It's a promise. So in verse 9, he says, so the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, and each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. So God's saying, gather me all these animals. And what do you think Abram's going to do to it? Do with all those animals? It doesn't sound very great, but he's going to... Exactly. Abram brought all of these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite of each other. So it's exactly what I was saying. He arranges them apart from each other. He puts the one half on one side, another half on the other side. So you can kind of get where this is going. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcass, but Abram drove them away. Because what is going on here is sacred. Abram is making sure that it is not being tampered with. It's not being tainted by other animals, and it's not being disturbed. As the sun was setting, and this is the most important part, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at an old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Now here's the gospel in this next text. So if we can go to the next verse, we have that up for you on the screen. Genesis chapter 1, verse 17 to 8. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a what? A covenant with Abram, and said, to your descendants I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates. I give you all these lands and all these places. On that day, the Lord made the covenant with Abram. Let me ask you, who walked through the animals? Was it Abram or was it God? It was God. Now, what's very interesting about this is something I didn't mention, is that when you're making the covenant, the person who is weaker, in other words, if you're making it with a lord or a serf, it doesn't matter. If you're making it with a king, the person who's supposed to walk through the halves is supposed to be the one that is lower. In other words, the servant is the one who's supposed to walk through. Why was Abram waiting for so long, all the way till the sunset? Why was he waiting so long for God to arrive? Because the covenant's supposed to take place in presence of both parties. But the person who was supposed to walk through the halves, remember the whole thing about, if I break this promise, I too will be split, I too will be cut in half. The person who's supposed to do that is the inferior, is the weaker, the servant, the lower. So it wasn't supposed to be God who was walking through. It's supposed to be Abram, or Abraham, as you know. Abraham was supposed to walk through, but that's not what happens in the story. Again, verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch, this is like the burning bush, this is a manifestation of God, this is God's presence, this is God in form, is walking through these things. It is very uncharacteristic, and something that is often missed. But what is this now saying? If it's not Abram, who's the lower, who's the lesser, who's the servant, if it's not Abram who's walking through, but instead it's God who's walking through, what does that mean? It's saying, God is saying that even if you break our covenant, I will be the one who's split. We have a promise together, and even if you break it, I will be the one who is split. We have this covenant, long-standing covenant with God. We continue to have this covenant with God, and we all sin. We all fall short of the glory of God. But the thing is, when we sin, it's not us who face the consequences, it's God. And we know exactly what that consequence took place, and that's in Jesus Christ. He's the one who suffered for our sake. That's why a lot of people get confused. Why is it that Jesus suffered for our sake? It's because in the covenant. Why did Jesus have to do that? Because in the covenant, he established that even if you are the one who breaks my promise, our covenant, I will be split. It's a story of grace all the way back in Genesis chapter 15. And so that's what covenant means. So when you hear it in the Bible, the next time you read this text, or when next time you read verses that use the word covenant, remember that even within the word, for example, even in Old Testament, New Testament, the word testament actually comes from the same root and could also mean Old Covenant, New Covenant. But regardless of Old Covenant and New Covenant, we still have this covenant and relationship and connection with God, but yet still it remains that even when you make mistakes, even when you sin, that's what the grace of Jesus is. That's what the sacrifice of Jesus is. Even though we've broken the covenant, even though we've broken the promise, we've broken the commandments, we've broken the law, Jesus is the one who will suffer the consequence. Once again, just like Lizelle mentioned last week, he's the God who stoops. Oftentimes, people will ask and say, I like the New Testament, but I don't like the Old Testament. But right there in the Old Testament, there is Jesus. There's the story of grace. There's the story. There is the gospel. And something that seems so almost horrific with the splitting of animals and almost gory sort of idea. But right there, God is doing an amazing thing and telling his people that I will stoop down. You don't have to do anything. I am the one who will keep our promise, and I am the one who will be split. Just return to me. You don't have to worry about anything. Just return and abide in me. Thank you for joining us once again for Grow Vespers. I'll see you next time. Next time Friday at 7:30, and I'll see the rest of you in church tomorrow early morning. Our closing song will be Heart of Worship. Here I am. my sin upon that cross. So here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Father God in heaven, we thank you so much that we can have the confidence, we can have the peace, we can have the comfort and the joy in knowing that the burden isn't on us. You've already done the work, Lord. You've already made the sacrifice. You were already split in half. You made the ultimate sacrifice for us, your children. And so, Father, may we go from this place. May we go to bed and go in our prayer with the understanding and knowledge that you've already done the work. May we have confidence in you. May we lean upon you. And have an everlasting bond and covenant with you and restore that covenant, that we may find